Welcome to the Sociology Tutor channel. We're looking at a feminist view on religion today to help you with your Sociology A-level. So I'm going to begin by giving a brief overview of what feminists think of society as a whole and how they interpret society. Then I'm going to give you 3 feminist views on religion. Feminists arguing that religion discriminates against women, that it's patriarchal. Then we're going to look at 4 pieces of evidence to back this up. So in your answers, when you want to get your examples in, we're going to give you 4 examples to use. And then we're going to finish with 3 counter-arguments, 3 evaluations to show that perhaps religion isn't patriarchal, or it isn't as simple to say religion dominates women. And at the very end of the video, I'm going to explain how I would answer a question on the topic. So if you stick around, you're definitely going to be able to use all of this information to get yourself a top mark in your essays in the exam. So to begin with, feminism is a structural theory. Now, structural theories are theories that start by taking an overall view of society. They take a top-down approach. They think, what is the structure of society? How do institutions teach that structure? How do institutions teach the norms and values? And then how does that shape people's behaviour? So structural theories see people as very strongly shaped by society. We're like puppets. We don't really have much free will. So, the family, education, the media, religion, they're all shaping us in a way which molds us into the structure of society. From a feminist perspective, the structure of society is patriarchal. It's male dominated. It's structured in a way which advantages men and disadvantages women. Now, we've covered ways in which this happens in the family, in education, and obviously in today's session we're looking at how does religion disadvantage women, and also how does it maintain men's superior position? How does it justify keeping women in an inferior role? Let's get started with the feminist views of religion. So the first theorist we're going to look at is Simone de Beauvoir. She argues that religion compensates women for the inferior position that they experience in society. So listen to this quote: "There must be a religion for women, as there must be one for the common people, and for exactly the same reason." So I'll say it one more time: there must be a religion for women, as there must be one for the common people, and for exactly the same reason. What is that reason that de Beauvoir is talking about? It's that women are in a second-class position in society and they need to be compensated for it. They need to experience something which justifies and in some way teaches them their inferior position is okay. And what de Beauvoir is saying with that quote is women are in a very similar position to the working classes, the common people, who also need something to justify their exploitation. So from Simone de Beauvoir's perspective, men control the institutions in society. So remember, the institutions are family, education, media, the legal systems, etc. And of course they control religion as well. And they use religion to justify to women their position. So religion isn't a form of direct control. It isn't a way of directly keeping women in an inferior position. But what it does is justify their inferior position. It teaches them that it's okay, or even more, that it's been put there by God. So for example, the main role that women take in religion is the mother role in most religious stories. And by teaching women that that role is divine, it's put there by God, it teaches them that their exploitation, their inferior position is justified. And in fact, what Simone de Beauvoir says is it actually gives them psychological rewards. It makes them feel good about their inferior position. From Simone de Beauvoir's perspective, religion deceives women. It brainwashes them. It teaches them that the mother role is divine, it's holy, it's put there by God. And therefore, it maintains traditional gender roles. It keeps women in the home. It stops them engaging in full employment. It keeps them in a disadvantaged position. So Simone de Beauvoir sees this as creating a sense of false consciousness in very similar way to the worker experiencing false consciousness through religion, according to Marxism. From her perspective, religion does the same thing to women. It creates false consciousness where they don't even know that their position is inferior, because religion is telling them that they're holy, that they are divine for being mothers. The second feminist thinker we're going to look at, who argues religion is patriarchal, is Mary Daly, and she focuses on Christianity. She argues that when the Catholic Church was established in Europe, it eliminated all of the goddess religions. So prior to the Catholic Church, paganism and various other religious beliefs, they would have celebrated the feminine, they would have celebrated goddesses. And what the Catholic Church and the Christian teachings as a whole do is eliminate all goddess religions. What they also do is eliminate the role of women within Christianity itself. So from Mary Daly's perspective, Christianity is a set of patriarchal stories. They're about men and they're written by men, and they eliminate women's roles. So no matter what roles women may have actually had in the stories, they're always diminished to the mother role. So from her perspective, Christianity, as I said, is this patriarchal set of stories which alienates women. It teaches them that they are inferior, that they don't have a place in the world because they don't have a place in these Christian stories. Not only that, these are the word of God, these stories. Therefore, it's going to have a very powerful effect on alienating women and teaching them that their roles are inferior. Furthermore, Daly argues women are taught the way out of this experience of alienation is to focus on prayer, to focus on spiritual matters, and not to organise amongst women and challenge the teachings and challenge the interpretation of Christianity. So from Mary Daly's perspective then, Christianity has eliminated the feminine, it's eliminated goddesses from other religions, and it's also diminished the role of women within the Christian teachings themselves. So it alienates women and it teaches them this is God's word, this is the will of God. The third feminist sociologist we're going to look at is Nawal alSaddawi, and she takes a really interesting view which you can use to evaluate in your answers. And she argues religion itself isn't patriarchal, it is where religion has emerged in patriarchal cultures and men have used religion to dominate women that it has become patriarchal. So religion on its own, from her perspective, is not patriarchal. It's about men using it, interpreting it in patriarchal cultures to control women. Now we're going to look at 4 pieces of evidence to show that religion is patriarchal. And the first piece of evidence is that religious stories, women often play inferior roles or they're completely absent from the story. So in religious stories, women play inferior roles or they're completely absent. So if we think about an example from Christianity, Jesus had 12 apostles. They were his sort of closest followers. They were all men. That would be an example you could use in your answers. So Jesus's closest followers, the people who occupy the biggest roles within the story, are men. Also, women can't be religious leaders in many religions. So in the Catholic Church, in Islam, in Orthodox Judaism, women cannot be religious leaders. They can't be priests, imams, etc. So again, women are kept out of leadership roles. Third reason is that the scriptures themselves often discriminate against women, and they imply that women should do what their husbands tell them, that they need to take an inferior role. They directly say it. So if you look at this quote, we can see it's suggesting that women take an inferior role to men, that they should do what their husband tells them. So the fourth and final example is that women's bodies are seen as polluting in many religions, that a woman's body should only be used for procreation, for having children, and that should only be within marriage. You know, sex before marriage should be limited. So in many religions, women's bodies are portrayed as corrupting, as polluting, as there to tempt men. So you've got 4 reasons there why religion may be seen as patriarchal. So now we're going to look at 3 ways in which religion isn't patriarchal. The first study we're going to look at is Helen Watson's study of the veil. Now, according to Watson, the Quran says that women should practice religious modesty or hijab. Islamic feminists and some Western feminists have argued men have used this to force women to cover their heads and their bodies when they're in the presence of men who aren't in their family. And this is a way of controlling women and controlling their self-expression or sexuality. Now, Watson says that that is a false way of interpreting it, and it shows a misunderstanding of what the hijab means to Muslim women. So she did some research where she interviewed Muslim women in a range of different countries, some in the UK, some in France, other countries too. And what she found was a completely different experience about how women felt about wearing the hijab. So one teenage girl in England who she interviewed, who was attending university, said that she felt that the hijab was actually a way of liberating her, that she could communicate with people, that she could move through society without being on display. And rather than it hiding her from society, actually it sort of promoted her image. It made her more visible as a woman, as a Muslim. So she didn't see it as a way of disadvantaging her or being controlled. She felt it freed her up to experience society in a more fuller and a more easier way. Other women who were interviewed talked about it as a way of resisting the Western emphasis on women as sex objects. So what this tells us, Watson's study shows us, in fact, is that sociologists need to be careful trying to explain religions that they're not familiar with without actually seeing them from the people's perspective, the people who are actually engaged in those religions. And from these women's perspective, the hijab was freeing them up and was also a way of resisting the aspects of Western society that they didn't like. The second argument against religion being patriarchal is that it is gradually changing. In a number of different religions, women can now be leaders. So for example, in the Church of England, women can become bishops. In non-Orthodox Judaism, the same is true. So it's gradually changing. Women can become leaders in a number of religions. It has to be said, there are also a very significant number more where they can't. So we need to balance that up, but we can say religion is becoming less patriarchal. The third and final argument is New Age movements, which are religious organisations that emerged in the 80s, which are loosely organised, very much about individual expression. They allow people to experience their activities in their own ways. They're often watered down Eastern religions. These New Age movements celebrate the goddess and the feminine, and they talk in and about the experiences of women in similar ways. So for example, neo-paganism, which is the worship of nature, Mother Nature, the earth, etc., that celebrates the goddess and the feminine. So New Age movements, new forms of religious practice, are much more celebratory of the feminine, of goddesses, than perhaps traditional religions have been. If you got a question that said, evaluate the feminist view of religion, it's hard to disagree that religion has been patriarchal and has been used as a way to oppress women because of the stories keeping women in an inferior position. You know, they don't celebrate the roles of women, and also women not being able to be church leaders. If I was answering a question that said, evaluate the feminist view of religion, I would tend to agree with it. It's hard to deny that the stories themselves and a lot of the practices have been patriarchal. Of course, you could bring in your evaluations and say that's changing gradually, and actually sometimes we need to interpret religion from women's perspectives themselves. You could use Helen Watson's study, but ultimately, taken as a whole, most religions tend to put women in inferior positions in the stories, in their organisations, and in the roles that they can perform. Another question you may get is evaluate the view that religion serves the needs of the ruling class. Now, the ruling class from a Marxist perspective are the bourgeoisie, but from a feminist perspective, it's men. If you got this question, again, you could really argue that it does serve the needs of men because it's kept women in these inferior roles. Now, a way to evaluate this, though, is to say, even if it does serve the needs of the ruling class, men, secularisation is so widespread now very few women are likely to be strongly influenced by religion in the way they were 100 years ago. So it may serve the needs of the ruling class, but it's probably not a powerful force in keeping women in an inferior position. One thing we do need to remember though is that women are more religious than men. This has been the case historically and it's still the case today. I'll cover the reasons for this when we look at religion and social groups, but just bear in mind women are more religious than men, so perhaps it does compensate for some of the disadvantage they experience. Perhaps that's why women are more religious than men still today. So where to go next? What I recommend you do is watch the videos on Marxism and functionalism, and that will complete your set of the theories of religion.